can. Let me begin with a couple of general comments before becoming more specific. The first general comment, the word religion itself, a reminder that, and I'm speaking obviously of English, so this applies to English, and you have different terms that we translate into English as religion from different languages that don't necessarily have the same precise connotation. But for our purposes, it is the connotation in English that is important, because the English word is a direct derivative of Latin. And in Latin, L vowel G is a binding. RE means back or again. So religio, religion, is that which binds us back or binds us again to the source that we humans believe has made us. However, we particularly conceive of that source, whether we think of it as a single divinity or a triune God or an endless array of divinities, whatever the particulars are, we humans seem to have in common with each other across our history and geography of a sense of something else that, having created us, has the power to destroy us. It can help us, harm us, hinder us, further us, bless us, curse us. And religion has as its point and its purpose to connect us back to it so that we are blessed and not cursed, helped, not harmed, furthered, not hindered. Second general comment, Islam, the term itself in Arabic, means to submit, to subordinate. The implication is to submit to the will of God, to the will of Allah. So anyone who is referred to as a Muslim, and again, using the orthography of writing in English, which gives us large and small letters, majuscule and minuscule, which not every writing system does. You can't do this with Devanagari. You can't do this with Hebrew. You can't do this with Arabic. You can with English. Large M, Muslim, large I, Islam, refers specifically to those who follow the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. But you can use the same word as the Prophet himself uses it, Muslim, small m, Islam, small I, to refer to anyone across time and space before, during, or after the time of the Prophet Muhammad who submits to God's will. So, for example, Abraham, is referred to in Islam quite appropriately as a Muslim, not capital M, because he's thousands of years before Muhammad, but as someone who has submitted to the will of God. And the basis for that understanding is a number of different times, places, occasions, circumstances in which Abraham is represented as having done that. None more important, and we'll get to this, of course, in a few moments, than when he is asked to and offers up his son as a sacrifice, although the demand or the command is withdrawn at the moment when it might have been fulfilled, when God recognizes Abraham's willingness to fulfill that commandment. Which leads me to a third general point, which is that every religious tradition, everyone, has two components to it. The first component is revelation. Every religious tradition starts with a text, whether it's oral or written, that it understands to have come to have been revealed by that ultimate source to and through particular conduits, particular passages. In English, we call them prophets, or we might call them priests, but the word, in fact, in Latin is sacerdos, using the root of sacer to refer to that realm of the other. The sacerdos is the one who gives us to the other and gives the other to us. So we can translate that as priest, as prophet. And obviously we have different words. We have in Arabic different words, Rasul, which has a slightly different connotation from Nabi. In Hebrew, we have Navi, which actually means mouthpiece, and so on and so forth. But what begins as revelation gives way, yields very quickly to interpretation. Because once the prophet or prophets is or are gone, we have no direct instruments through which to ask God, wait, what did you mean when you said such and such? So if God says, thou shalt not commit murder, and I think, oh my gosh, a mosquito landed on my wrist, can I smash that mosquito, or does that constitute murder? these kinds of questions, and obviously there are endless arrays of questions that the answers to which define how I define myself, small m, as a Muslim, meaning someone who submits to God's will. So every religious tradition is balanced between or struggling between revelation and interpretation. In Sanskrit, the equivalent terms would be shruti and smrti, heard and remembered. So a text is heard, it's understood to be, as it were, revealed. Smrti, remembered, is more like interpreted. And you have interpretations in every tradition as to what is considered to be shruti and smrti. That's your first level of interpretation. For Jews, the entirety of the revelation is the Hebrew Bible. For Christians, the Hebrew Bible is just part of the revelation that continues with the New Testament. For Muslims, the Bible, however it is understood, the Torah, the Gospels, the Psalms, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the intertestamental text, all of that is understood as revealed, but preparatory for the consummate revelation, the Quran, which is not revealed for Jews and Christians. If I look at a text like the Mahabharata, I understand it to be smrti. It's not a revealed text, but embedded within it, there's a small piece called the Bhagavad Gita, the divine song. And if I am someone who believes that Krishna is the consummate manifestation of divinity, then the Bhagavad Gita is a shruti text embedded within a smrti larger text. But if I'm not a believer in Krishna as the consummate manifestation of God, if Krishna is, let's say, just one of the avatars of Shiva, or in fact, if my primary focus, I meant of Vishnu, not Shiva, Vishnu, or if my primary focus is on Shiva or Brahma, so I'll look at the Bhagavad Gita and I'll say, no, it's just part of the smrti text that we call the Mahabharata. So everything that pertains to how we as a species address that other, focused on a kind of umbilicus, which is a revealed text, is subject to an ongoing pattern of revelation, beginning with the question of what actually constitutes the revelation. I meant an ongoing pattern of interpretation, beginning with what we regard as the revelation, and then if we agree on a particular text as revealed, how we particularly interpret it. So if I look at the religion of Islam, for example, the consummate revealed text, as I just said, is the Quran. It's understood to be a text that was revealed over the course of 22 years to the Prophet Muhammad, from what on the Gregorian calendar would be the year 610 until his death in the year 632. But if I want to understand what Islam is, I won't really get a full enough understanding if I only read the Quran, because there develops a whole body of material called hadith, which often represents the Prophet speaking in his own right, not as a conduit through which God is speaking, or which offers us stories about the Prophet or about the circumstances of his life and those around him. And beyond hadith, there evolve, as with every other religious tradition as well, a whole range of different interpretive bodies of being Muslim. So I call myself Sunni, or I call myself Shi'i, or within Sunni, I call myself a Hanafi Sunni Muslim, or I call myself a Shafi'i Sunni Muslim, or within the Hanbali school, I say, well, I follow the particular path that was laid out by Ibn Taymiyyah, that was then laid out by Ibn al-Wahhab. So if I'm a Muslim from Saudi Arabia, my official religion is Wahhabi, which is a subset of Sunni, which is a subset of Islam. Again, you can look across the panoply of religious traditions across the world and find the same phenomenon that derives from the fact that even when we share a particular revelation in common, we are likely as humans to have different understandings of what the revelation really means, what I'm supposed to do. So all this brings me to this idea of Eid, which, as Ananta ji pointed out, as a term, appears only once in the 5th surah of the Quran. And so it means a feast or a celebration. But the tradition that develops within Islam, it's not directly, overtly in the Quran, is that the Prophet Muhammad after the Hijrah, when he came to what was then called Al-Yathrib, that later came to be called Al-Madinah, the city, because of its importance to his life, that he observed the Medinians celebrating two different festivals. So as he so often did, he adopted and adapted to his own understanding of God and how one should address God, the phenomenon, the idea of two modes of celebration. So what eventually emerges by way of Hadith and subsequent traditions is, first of all, Eid al-Fitr, which is the Eid that was mainly just addressed by Ananta ji. Fitr meaning fast breaking. So as Islam develops, it develops five principal aspects of how one is properly a Muslim, five pillars. And by the way, nowhere in the Quran do you have simply the five pillars laid out. So again, if I want to understand Islam, it's not sufficient to read the Quran. I have to see what grows beyond the Quran. Just as within Judaism, it's not enough to read the Torah or the Hebrew Bible. I've got to read the rabbinic material. I can't just read the New Testament or just the Gospels to understand Christianity. I have to consider how the patristic and the scholastic literature develops, and so on and so on and so forth. In English, we use the word Hindu all the time, as if there is a common religion in India of which all practitioners are identically directed. And of course, that's not the case. It's not even a correct term to use that word as if it refers to a religion, because if I'm Shaivite or if I'm Krishnite, that's not the same thing, and so on. So coming back to Eid al-Fitr, so Muhammad is represented as determined that there should be two primary festivals in Islam as well. And Islam develops along the five paths, five principal paths, five pillars. So the first is belief. The second is formal prayer. And even that idea, Muslims pray formally, usually 5 times a day. That too is not found anywhere in the Quran. Here are the 5 times of prayer. You have different places, 3 different places in the course of the Quran that mention prayer. And one place mentions these 3 times, another place mentions these 2 times, another mentions these 2 times. You put it all together and you end up with what become the 5 times of prayer in the ordinary, everyday Muslim day. But it's something that is arrived at by way of hadith, be that as it may. So belief that there is no God but God, that Muhammad is the consummate prophet, that there are other prophets before him, that there is divine judgment, that there is good and evil, all of these, heaven and hell, all of these are part of the first principle of belief. The second, again, is prayer, 5 formal times. You can informally pray any number of times. The 3 other pillars include charity, and that again comes in a formal tithing and also informal charity that one might give. You see a beggar on the street and you hand the beggar some money, that's informal. But in the course of the year, you contribute to the community a standard amount, which is used for, well, helping the community, for social services and the like. The 4th is fasting. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And the 5th is the pilgrimage, the Hajj. So ideally, in the course of my life as a Muslim, I want to go on pilgrimage at least once to Mecca. And if it's a real full pilgrimage, I'll visit Mecca. There are certain places in Mecca that I visit. Obviously, the Kaaba is the central place. But if I have the time and I really want to do it fully, I'll go from Mecca to Medina and back to Mecca, recapitulating the Hijrah, the journey, the migration that the Prophet himself made, going from Mecca to Medina, Yathrib, and then eventually back again. The fast, I said I'd come back to that, evolves. It starts out being on the 10th day of the 8th month. It then becomes the first 10 days, ultimately becomes the entire month, which is the month of Ramadan or Ramazan, depending upon how you're pronouncing it. And because, keep in mind, the Muslim calendar is a fully lunar calendar, so it follows the path of the moon around the earth, as opposed to the Gregorian calendar that is used in most of the world, where we follow the path of the earth around the sun. So in the United States, for example, we have a Gregorian calendar. And so our year is 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 45.7 seconds long. Or at least that's what a friend told me when I was 8 years old, and I never bothered to check. I took his word for it. And the Muslim calendar is about 355 days of the Muslim year, which means that the Muslim months are shifting 10 to 11 days year by year by year relative to the Gregorian calendar, which means that the month of Ramadan could be in July, it could be in January, it could be anywhere in between. And I'll come back to that in a few moments. So Eid al-Fitr, which is the first of the two holidays that according to Hadith was established by the Prophet Muhammad, is the holiday that marks the end of the month-long fast. So it's the major celebration, the major feast that breaks the fast in a formal way. So that will have happened a while back because Ramadan ended a while back, not that long ago, but a while back. The second, and what is considered the more major of the two feasts, is Eid al-Adha, and that's what is being celebrated over the last couple of days across the Muslim world. Again, Eid is feast or celebration. Again, to remind you, it's a term that occurs in Surah 5 of the Quran, as Ananta ji pointed out. Adha is a word that means sacrifice. It is considered to be the equivalent of a more common Arabic word, qurban, which, by the way, has a precise Hebrew equivalent, which is korban. It's virtually the same word, and that's not surprising because Hebrew and Arabic are very close siblings. They are like French and Italian as two children of a common parent. So Eid al-Adha then is the feast or celebration of sacrifice. So the question then becomes, sacrifice of what? And the answer is Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son. And that in and of itself offers us an interesting aspect of revelation and interpretation as the two pillars, as it were, upon which every religious tradition stands, and upon which religious traditions that derive from a common ancestor, but then go in their individuated directions, stand. So in Genesis 22, in the Torah, part of the Hebrew Bible, part of what Jews and Christians alike regard as the beginning point of the revelation that articulates what become their respective traditions. And to repeat, for Jews, the Torah will be the center of the Hebrew Bible, and in its totality, that will be revelation. For Christians, the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible is a kind of prelude to the more important text of the New Testament. And for some Christians, Catholics and Orthodox Christians, intertestamental texts that are not regarded as part of the Bible for Protestant denominations, not considered part of the Bible for Jews. So again, what constitutes the revelation is itself a matter of interpretation. But Genesis 22 is looked at by all Jews and Christians as a definitive text in which Abraham is represented as responding to God's command to take his son Isaac and offer him at a site that God chose, which is Mount Moriah. And at the last moment, when Abraham he's tied up his son, he's put him on the altar, he's put the wood under, the lower part of the altar, he's kindled the flames. And at that moment, when he stands over his son with a knife, there's a voice that he hears. And the voice is, send forth not thy hand against the lad. And Abraham looks, and caught in a thicket is a ram that he and Isaac then offer in lieu of Isaac himself. And the point and the principle and the import of the story, of course, is in a sense twofold. One, that this represents the culmination of 10 tests over the course of the previous 9 or 10 chapters of the book of Genesis that were imposed upon Abraham regarding his faith. And obviously this was the culminating test because his son Isaac. More importantly, as you know, Abraham has two sons. Isaac is one, Ishmael is the other. Isaac is the son by Sarah. Ishmael the son by Hagar or Hajar. And in Genesis, Ishmael and Hagar had already been sent away by Abraham because Sarah was concerned that Ishmael was picking too much on Isaac. He was the older son, and maybe her son was going to be hurt by Hagar's son, as she was concerned that because Hagar had a son first, she lost respect for Sarah. There was a whole series of things going on here, but the point is, where Jews and Christians and their understanding of this moment is concerned, Ishmael is kind of gone from the scene. We don't see him again until the death of Abraham, when he and Isaac come together to bury their father. By contrast, for Islam, within the Quran, in Surah 37, there is a kind of ambiguity as to which son it is. The consequence of which is that over the course of time, there was, particularly in the 9th through 12th centuries, a debate within the Muslim world as to whether it was Ishmael or Isaac. And a minority view, mostly Shi'i Muslims, continued to believe that it was Isaac, as do the Jews and the Christians. But the majority of Muslims, and 83% of the Muslim world is Sunni, so certainly all the Sunni and some Shi'i as well, believe on the contrary that it was Ishmael. So you ask, well, how is that possible? Ishmael was already sent away. No, that's what we get in Genesis. That's what Jews and Christians believe, because for Jews and Christians, Genesis is the consummate accounting of this. But for Muslims, the whole point and purpose of the Quran arriving later in time was to adjust misconceptions that had set in, correct errors that had somehow manifest themselves within these earlier texts. And so it is not a given that because in Genesis we find Ishmael already gone, Isaac, the only son, still around, that that's actually what happened. So for a Muslim believer that it was Ishmael, and I repeat, that's the majority of Muslims, Ishmael, in fact, according to Hadith, was not sent away. Ishmael was taken by Ibrahim together with Hajar. They went on a kind of hijrah down to the area that is today Mecca and Medina, known as the Hijaz in Arabic. And it was there that Ibrahim and Ishmael, and they were going there so that they could find a proper wife for Ishmael. He and Ishmael built an altar called the Kaaba. The Kaaba would eventually, over the course of time, get misdirected as a center of pagan worship. When the Prophet Muhammad took control of Mecca around the year 628 on our calendar, one of the things he did was to restore the Kaaba to its original purpose, which was as a place marked off by Ibrahim and Ismail as a kind of spiritual meeting point between God and ourselves. And so the Kaaba emerged and evolved and became, and still of course is, the ultimate center of the Muslim world as far as a connectivity to God is concerned, which is why the Hajj, the pilgrimage, as one of those 5 pillars, is not just towards Mecca, it's most specifically to the Kaaba. That's my goal as a Muslim pilgrim. That's the entity that I go around and around 7 times, and so on and so forth. And it is understood as a monument, as a place marker, as a place of gathering, a masjid, where established by Ibrahim and Ismail, who is then understood as the son who was offered by Ibrahim. And that's why we have the text in Surah 37, where it appears to be Ismail who says, when God says to his son, the Lord has told me I've got to sacrifice you. And Ismail, he's worried, he's a little bit upset about that. Ismail says, no, father, you must do what you must do. At the moment when the sacrifice would have happened, as in Genesis 22, so in Surah 37 of the Quran, a ram or a lamb, in one understanding, appears and is sacrificed in lieu of the son who would have been. So one of the most important aspects of Eid al-Adha, the feast of the sacrifice, by the way, also called Eid al-Kabir, which means the great feast, because Eid al-Fitr, to remember, is the Eid al-Saghir, the smaller feast. So the centerpiece of it is that a lamb is sacrificed, or some other animal if a lamb is not available. And typically it's divided then into three parts. It's meat, and part goes to the family, part goes to relatives and friends, and part goes to the poor and needy. So take note, one of the more important aspects of this celebration is to assure that everyone has the means of celebrating, everyone has food to eat, everyone has the symbolic instrument of connectivity to God. And so the spiritual and the social, if I can put it that way, are intimately connected. And so typically a sixth prayer to the ordinary 5 prayers that are given daily will be celebrated during Eid al-Adha at the mosque. So, you know, ideally I can pray all the time in a mosque, but the fact of the matter is I can pray wherever I am, because if God is everywhere, then I can pray anywhere. I simply have to direct myself, it's called qibla, orientation, towards Mecca in my prayers. You know, and in the old days, if you visited any Muslim country and you stayed in some hotel, any hotel would have some marker on some piece of furniture that would indicate the direction, the qibla of Mecca, so you'd know what direction to pray in. Nowadays, of course, you get an app on your cell phone, then all you do is punch in the app and it tells you exactly what the correct direction is. I have been many, many times with Muslim friends when it's prayer time, and they'll pull out the app and say, okay, we point ourselves this way. But you want to at least once a week, usually the noon prayer on Friday. Friday in Arabic is called Juma. So now we just call it Juma prayers, to meet together as a community in the mosque, in the masjid. So that's what's going to happen. That's what happens on Eid al-Adha as the 6th time of prayer. And then afterwards, everyone exchange sweets, they exchange gifts, they exchange visits, and so on and so on and so forth. So all of this is part and parcel of the way in which a Muslim, capital M, in today's world, connects him or herself to the many Muslims, both capital M, and in the case of Ibrahim, Ismail, Isaac, small m, who connected and tied themselves to God, who were obedient to God's will, who were willing to go so far as, in the case of Isaac or Ismail, be sacrificed. In the case of Ibrahim, to offer the sacrifice of my son in obedience to God, the response from God in the end, of course, being, no, I don't want your son. I was just testing your faith. So to finish up my comments, the whole idea of this celebration is to elaborate on and think hard about the whole notion of what it means to submit to God's will. There are in the Hadith traditions, for example, that Iblis, that the devil, tried to tempt Abraham away from doing it. And Abraham threw stones, pebbles at Iblis to send him away. So by the way, when I go on Hajj, there are a number of places I visited, not the Kaaba, not only the Kaaba, as I said. And one of those places, Arafat, there are 2 pillars, and I run back and forth, and I throw pebbles at those pillars as a recollection of that moment for Ibrahim. And ultimately, it's about connecting oneself to God. It's about sacrificing. It connects to the idea of fast that is so important, because when I fast, I'm focusing on the spiritual rather than on the physical. I'm showing that I can be other than an animal that has to eat. I can desist from eating even if I'm hungry and focused on my spirituality. And that's very much, I think, what Eid al-Fitr emphasizes, because it culminates the end of Ramadan, the month of fast. And Eid al-Adha is about sacrifice. And let me just say one last word that brings me full circle back to the language with which I began, which was Latin, religio. The word sacrifice, another English language word from Latin, comes from the 2 components, sacer and facere. And I already mentioned sacer as referring to the realm of the other. And in this case, most particularly God, divinity, however I conceive of it. Facere in Latin means to make. Sacer facere coming together give us in Latin sacrificare, from which we get the word in English sacrifice. So to sacrifice means to make myself sacer. And if you think about the story of Ibrahim and his sons, Abraham as a sacerdos is so connected, he makes himself so close